basing my brief comments here this evening on a book that's going to be coming out, and this is not pushing this book. It's called A Spirituality of Beauty, New Pathways to God for the 21st Century. And it's being published by Flawless Press. And I am delighted that it's not out at this moment. I thought it would be. So that means I can talk about the things that are in the book. If the book was out, I was going to have to do something else. So I'm able to actually, much of what I'm going to be saying, I'm gleaning from what's in that text that should be coming out somewhere in the next month or two. Having said that, I have a motto in life that goes, in the end, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and charity. But the greatest of these is flexibility. So, therefore, when I go over the agenda for the evening, which I'll do in a few moments, and this is the God's truth. If you don't like what I'm proposing, I'm happy to talk about something else. Okay, so where do I want to go with this? I'd like to, if it's okay with you, give a general introduction in terms of where the world is at, right, and where the church is at in the context of that world, but more importantly, where is spirituality in that context, right? And as I paint that picture and kind of give you this quick overview, I then want to propose what I call in my book a spirituality of beauty, right? And I'm suggesting that recapturing the sense of beauty will bring spirituality into a new place for the 21st century, right? And that's where I'm going with this. Now, the pillars upon which I'm basing my thought are these. Number one, Pope John Paul II wrote really a beautiful letter to artists. It's a very, very brief letter. It's maybe 15 or 20 pages. And it's really a magnificent work, I think, written to artists, right? So that's the first. The second is Hans von Balthasar, who was a Jesuit, who later left the Jesuits, and he writes a lot on beauty and the place of beauty in the spiritual life. So I'd like to speak a little bit about him. The third would be the Second Vatican Council. At the end of the Second Vatican Council, there was an address that was given. There were addresses that were given to various constituencies, one of which was to artists. And so those are the sources or the foundations upon which I'd like to build a spirituality of beauty. So I'd like to speak about each of those, and then I'd like to give you some practical places where you might go in your own reflection and using beauty as a tool for your Lenten journey. So when I get into the practicalities of it, I'm going to talk about beauty as a way in which we recapture, reshape our images of God. I'll talk about beauty as a way of approaching the scriptures. I'll speak about beauty as a way of understanding the Trinity. And I also will speak about beauty as a way of bringing art and music and the aesthetics into our spiritual lives, right? So that's the basic outline. Now, let me jump in. Okay, and let me begin. I'd like to mention a little story that I'm going to share with you this evening that I usually don't talk about, but I'll mention it anyway because here I am. I feel very much at home in this group. A couple of years ago, one of my sisters, her daughter was going to be in this play. Don't take this offense at this. I hate going to those little pageants and plays and musicals that these kids are in. Just, I mean, I hate these things, right? But for the sake of peace and love and family, I go to this thing. To me, this is like torture, right? So anyway, I'm at this thing, and my little niece comes out, right, to quote, sing, and quote. And she comes out, she has this little dress that was like too short, it was up to here. She has collared hair, it's sticking out like this. And she starts to sing and she can't insane. It was just an absolutely pathetic sight, right? And I'm sitting there next to my poor sister, saying, oh my God, my poor sister. These were all of her friends and her neighbors, and I said, oh my God, she's probably going to have to sell the house or do whatever. And as my niece was getting off the stage, thank God, she's getting off the stage, and dear God, help me, give me the words for my sister, what to say. I was so upset for her. So she takes me by the arm. If you meet my sister, please don't tell the story. Takes me by the arm, and she says, Anthony. I says, yeah, Tina, I know. And then she says, wasn't that just beautiful? And I said, well, actually, I said, I'm kind of speechless. I'm not sure what to say. I figured maybe she was on meds or something. Right? But what struck me, she was looking at this with the mother's eyes. Right? And I couldn't help but think of Julian of Norwich, the great mystic in the 14th century, who told us that God is a mother. And I begin with that anecdote, which unfortunately is a true story, simply from this perspective. I do think that when we get into the beautiful, it requires a different set of eyes. And I want to propose to you, and this is transgender, I want to propose to you that it's looking at the world with the mother's eyes. And by that I mean, it's getting in touch with the feminine, right? That's within all creatures, and really integrating the feminine and the masculine within us, right? Because that's we talk about God in that fashion. And to the degree that we do this, I think that our eyes are open to new expressions of beauty. And this is what I'm proposing, is that when we talk about spirituality, and we talk about the pathway to God, I'm proposing that we're in a new place where we have never been before. And in this new place where we are, where we've never been before, I'm suggesting that we need another way, or another way of saying is we need to peel a layer off the onion of how we see this person whom we call God. And how do we enter into relationship with this God? It's something new for us. Built on a tradition, but something new. It was Karl Rahner who said that there are three major epochs in the history of the church. And the first epoch, he said, was when those first Jews became Christian. This was the first major transition, the first traumatic transition in the community that we call the church. The second, he says, is when Christianity became an institution on a par with other institutions with the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century. And that was the second major transition. The third is what he predicted. Actually, he foresaw what's happening now. He said the third element would be this. He said when Christianity, and especially Catholicism, would no longer be a European religion. It was Christopher Dawson that wrote that Europe is the church, and the church is Europe. And that was true at one time. Now, as you well know, 2/3 of the church now are outside of Europe, primarily in Asia, right? Especially in the Philippines, in Africa, and in Latin America. It's a different face of what the church is. And what he says is, as we moved into this third epoch, that structures will begin to collapse. Right? Not as in but the structures that held a European religion together and served it well for a long time, that those structures were no longer adequate. And what he says is that God would begin to break through these structures. And that we would be brought into this time of chaos. And he compared this time of chaos to what we read in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, that the Spirit breathes over the chaos. And as the Spirit breathes over the chaos, something is created. And so he says, really, the best is yet to come. And he says, as we move into this epic, it would be painful and exciting at the same time. So we live in this bittersweet moment in the history of the world. The other person, to contextualize this, that I mentioned, is Thomas Friedman. And Thomas Friedman has the book is a little old now, it's 10, 15 years old, called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. It's a great book about globalization, right? And he really helps you understand what that word means. But briefly, what he says is this, that with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which was 1988 or 89, he said that everything now is totally changed. And what Friedman said was, we would all have to go back to school and learn all over again, because it's a new cosmology. It's a new way of looking at the world. And what he said was that prior to the collapse of communism, right, he said there were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And he says if you had to have an image, it'd be the image of two sumo wrestlers fighting with each other for power. And that's what went on in the Cold War period. What he says now, with globalization and the advances in technology, that we all have access to the power now. And so there are several new superpowers that are emerging. And he says that the image is no longer the two sumo wrestlers, but it's the 100-yard dash. And every morning when we get up, we're in the race. And just because we're in the race today doesn't mean that it's finished, because tomorrow the race starts all over again. So what Friedman says, that in this context, the problem is this, that he's not writing from a religious point of view. What he says is that the biggest danger of our time is that we have forgotten what it means to be human. And that in being involved in this process of globalization, which is a good thing, he says we need to be careful that we don't lose our humanity, right? And what I'm proposing to you is, as we talk about a new spirituality in this 21st century, in the church that is no longer European, and as we talk about new pathways to God, I'm suggesting to you that we are discovering in deeper ways what it means to be human. And as we discover in deeper ways what it means to be human, therein we discover God. And therein we discover the root of all beauty and the pathway to all beauty. And the third is what Sister Jean mentioned, for those here from the Catholic tradition, the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council was a phrase that you've heard so often, was an adjournamento. An adjournamento. Open the windows. And as you mentioned, Father Orsi said, it was a tsunami of the Holy Spirit. The tsunami of the Holy Spirit. And you're not going to stop this tsunami. You might try. You're not going to stop it. It was Pope Benedict XVI, in calling forth this year, they talked about opening doors. Opening doors. So what I want to suggest is this. The Second Vatican Council, right, that concluded in 1965, Second Vatican Council opened windows and opened doors. But more importantly, I want to propose to you, it opened human hearts. It opened human hearts. You see, my friends, and as human hearts have been opened, everything is different, isn't it? We are changed. We are transformed. And what was talked about in the Second Vatican Council, whether you agree with it, whether you don't agree with it, whether you've heard about it, or whether you've never heard about it, it's in our DNA. It's there. It's in our DNA. It opens the way to the heart. Now, it was St. Augustine, as you know, in the 4th century, who wrote the famous piece in his Confessions. When he wrote, if you don't mind my quoting, "Late have I loved you, beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. Lo, you were within, but outside, seeking there for you. You called, shouting, you broke through my deafness. You flared, blazed, banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance. I gasped, and now I pant for you. I tasted you, and I hunger and I thirst. You touched me, and I burn for your peace. O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Now, what I want to propose to you in this 21st century is building a spirituality on beauty which is ever ancient, but also ever new. And that's the exciting moment that we are experiencing in the history of the world right now. Now, I am just back from Thailand and Bangkok. I was there for several weeks at the Jesuit retreat centers in Bangkok and Chiang Mai, doing some work on Thomas Merton, who you know died in Bangkok. And I want to say, this is not a travel blog, I have to say, it's the first time I was there, by the way, I was so touched. Well, you're talking about a population that is 99% Buddhist. Christianity is less than 1%. I was so touched by the goodness of these people. Extraordinary. Extraordinary. And their gentleness, their kindness, the way in which they walk around the universe. So I discussed when I was at the Jesuit retreat houses, my work on beauty. And so they talked to me about the place of the heart. And I'd like to just say a few things from Thai about the heart and how this ties into what I'd like to speak about here this evening. Now, the word heart within Thai there's about 300 variations on the word, right? And I jotted down just a few of them that I wanted to include in this presentation this evening. By the way, I don't speak Thai. I have a tendency to Italianize all words, so I'm sure that these are incorrect pronunciations. But the first is kajai, which means to enter into the heart. Kajai, to enter into the heart. And so in the Buddhist tradition, and especially among the people from Thai, it's entering into the hearts of one another. It's really what Cardinal Newman said when he wrote that it's heart meeting heart. So it's really moving out of our head, with what we like to do, or I like to do in the West, and it is the journey into the heart. The second is namjai, which means water party. Water party. And I found out while I was there, water party is kindness that flows from us like springs of water. And that as we are in touch with the kindness of a God, our power greater than ourselves, and we allow God's kindness and mercy to enter into us, we become, using this Thai word, fountains of kindness in the context of the world. The third is sabajai, and that is comfort part, meaning feeling comfortable with yourself, right? We would say being comfortable in your own skin. So part of where I go in my work on beauty, you can't see the beauty out there unless you begin to see it in here. And they capture this in this phrase. The third, or the final, is Bekbaijai, which means heart home. It refers to your heart opening to the world around you. Your heart opening to the world, you see? And this is what was compelling about the Second Vatican Council. It opens us up to the world. It's a good place. It's a beautiful place. And it was really what Teilhard prefigured in his writings, especially on Hymn of the Universe. It is what Thomas Merton in his writings, in his spiritual journey, that led him into the world as this beautiful place, as this wonderful place where we find the home of God in finding each other. Now, what was most surprising to me was this. In some of the temples in Chiang Mai, they have more temples than Carter has Liverpool. So something like, I don't know, 4,000 temples and whatever. So I didn't do 4,000 of them. But in some of the temples, you're going to be surprised to hear this, they had statues of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. I said, tell me, what's this about? Well, this is what? This is really a person of God that they would place next to the Buddha. And it is the heart of grace, right? And it's really a way of looking at the spiritual journey as opening our hearts up to the world, to God, to ourselves, and to one another. And it was in the Jerusalem Bible translation. It's only in the Jerusalem Bible translation. There is the word tenderness in the Jerusalem Bible translation. And if you look at it carefully in translation, the word tenderness is used in that translation with the French word la brie, which means the arms. So when you take entendre, right, the tender, la brie with the arms, is to stretch out one's arms in a welcoming gesture. To stretch out one's arms in a welcoming gesture. And that's what I saw in the Buddhist notion of including the Sacred Heart as an open arms with open hearts. So it's really a spirituality of the heart. For these underpinnings, I'm going to mention several. The first is, here we go, the first is the letter of Pope John Paul II to artists. And I'm going to speak briefly about it, but it really would be worth your reading. It's a great, great piece. What John Paul II in his letter says is this. He quotes Dostoevsky. And what Dostoevsky says is this, that beauty will transform the world. That beauty will transform the world. And what John Paul II says is, quoting Dostoevsky, you cannot be in the presence of a work of beauty and not in some way be transformed. See, beauty transforms, right? And being in the presence of a work of beauty brings you to a new place, right? He quotes of the Polish poet, Adam Mickiewicz, who wrote that from chaos rises the world of the Spirit. From chaos rises the world of the Spirit. The Pope concluded, may your art help to affirm that true beauty, which as a glimmer of the Spirit of God will transfigure matter, opening the human soul to the sense of the eternal. You see? And what John Paul II is saying, in the midst of chaos, our hearts are open to the eternal. Because God is creating in the midst of chaos, he says. And finally, he mentions Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who described the powerful spirituality that is stimulated by art in his 1970 Nobel Peace Acceptance speech when he said, art inflames even a frozen, darkened soul to a high spiritual experience. Even a hard, darkened soul like mine. To a higher spiritual experience, you see. And so, what John Paul II is saying, in effect, is this. We are called to be artisans of the spiritual life. We are, what he says, we're called to become ministers of God's beauty. As we experience the beautiful, and as we are transformed by the beautiful, we now become works of beauty in the way we interact with others. And how can they not be in our presence if we truly become beautiful and not in some way be transformed? So when we talk about transformation, what John Paul II is saying, it's happening in the context of how we relate as ministers and artisans of God's beauty. The second source for my work is the documents of the Second Vatican Council, which is not the purpose of our time here this evening. However, at the end of the council, December 8, 1965, there were 7 speeches that were given, right? And these speeches are like a page long from 7 different cardinals. And these 7 speeches were the agenda of the 21st century. So when I talk about the council, I like to look at it futuristically rather than debating the past. We have been given a direction. Let's talk about it. See, now, one of the speeches was to artists. And I like to quote part of the speech because it's part of what my work is based on. And here's the quote. "This world in which we live needs beauty in order not to sink into despair." Our world needs beauty, not to sink into despair. It is beauty, like truth, which brings joy to the heart of men and women, and is that precious fruit which resists the year and tear of time, which unites generations and makes them share in things of admiration. And all of this is through your hands. May these hands be pure and disinterested. Remember that you are the guardians of beauty in the world. And may that suffice to free you from tastes which are passing and have no genuine value, to free you from the search after strange or unbecoming expressions. Be always and everywhere worthy of your ideals, and you will be worthy of the church which by our voice addresses to you today her message of friendship, salvation, grace, and blessing. And so what the council is saying is the world needs beauty. And beauty prevents us from sinking into despair, right? And I want to pose to you this evening and also in my book that really that is our mission, I believe. And this was the mission or the agenda given to us at the time of the Second Vatican Council. And I just find it a compelling mission. We're so privileged really to have this mission, to be in touch with beauty and to bring God's beauty into the context of our world. The third I'm going to mention very briefly because this will put you to sleep for sure. Hans Balthasar is a rather complex theologian. But Balthasar has some pretty neat things to say about beauty. Right? And I'm going to keep this simple for tonight. All right? However, it can be quite complex. And if you really get into this, you're going to want to look at his work. So I'm just going to mention that in passing. But basically what he's saying, in a nutshell, in a few sentences, right, it is this, that what we call beauty needs form. And by form, he gets into Duns Scotus. Scotus talks about the scandal of the particular, right? And so what Balthasar is saying, beauty needs to become concrete. It needs form. To say it another way, you need to be able to touch it, to see it, to smell it, and to hear it. It needs form. And he says that the first form of beauty, or the first scripture of beauty, is the world. It is the form or the container of God's beauty, says Balthasar. And so he has volumes in which he talks about what it means to get in touch with that form that we call the world. And then he talks about the scriptures themselves as being a form or a context. And what he's proposing, and I will spend a little time talking about this, is learning how to read the scriptures in another way. We've read the scriptures many times, but he's proposing, and I'll spend a little time on this, how do we bring a new set of eyes? How do we bring a mother's eyes? How do we go to the scriptures and see it another way so it's not same old, same old, same old? It's a living text, and it's discovering the form in a new way, is what he's proposing. So those are the foundational points. Now, having said all of that, I'd like to, I'm laughing because now I'm going to give you hopefully some practical things. My mother would laugh whenever I said I was practical, but that's another story. Okay, I'd like to propose 3, 4, 5, 6 practical ways of, well, we'll do our best. Maybe we'll do 6. We'll see how we do. How do we get our arms around this spirituality and beauty, living the way of the heart in the 21st century? All right? And let me just say what these things are, and hopefully I'll get to each of them. The first is what I call an invitation to beauty, learning to live in the present moment. The second is what I call the symphony of the Word of God. The Scriptures as music. The third is us becoming artisans of the spiritual life. We're all artists of the spiritual life through poetry. Right? The fourth is I like to talk about our God, however it is that we call God, through art, through Rublev's Trinity, and through the novel The Shack, bringing us to other ways of looking at who God is and how we let God into our lives. And then finally, I'd like to say a few words about the God who is beauty. God is beauty. He is the source of all beauty, and God is beauty itself. So those are the 6 practical things that I'd like to speak about. Now, the first in your handout, if I can find it, here we go. The first is on, just look at the first section here, entitled An Invitation to Beauty. And I'm just going to look at the first bullet point here as an example of going to literature. And in this case, it's Gordon Wilder's play Out of Town. And I'd like to look at that little piece very quickly and speak about it as an invitation to beauty. And again, as you can see, I go into many other quotes here, but I'm just going to talk about the first one. Right? Gordon Wilder's play Out of Town has for its aim that we never fully appreciate the gift of life. Our town implicitly makes a powerful case for the meaning and value of leisure. Emily Webb, after dying in childbirth of her second child, asks if she can relive the happiest day of her life, her 12th birthday. As her mother is busy preparing the birthday party, Emily speaks, "Oh, Mama, just look at me 1 minute as though you really saw me. Let's look at one another." And a moment later she exclaims, "It goes so fast. We don't have time to look at one another." And a moment later she exclaims, "It goes so fast. We don't have time to look at one another." I didn't realize. So all that was going on and we never noticed. Heartbroken, she realizes that people don't appreciate how beautiful life is. She learns that only the poets and saints appreciate how wonderful life is. Everyone else is too busy. See? And the invitation to beauty is this. We need to frame the moment. Put a frame around the moment. See, when you put a frame, your attention is called. So putting a frame around the moment, whatever that is, I'm talking to a vision, if I'm eating an apple, if I'm looking at a sunrise, if I'm looking at the snow, frame the moment. Right? And I'd like to put it in this way. When you read the Scriptures, God is not defined as I was who I was. God is not a God of the past. Give up the hope of a better past. Just give it up. Give up the hope of a better past. Why? Because God doesn't live there. Right? In the Scriptures, God is not defined as I will be who I will be. God is not a God who is caught in our anxieties about the future. Right? We're not caught in our anxieties about the future and our desire to control the future. Right? So on the one hand, we have our fears, the other end we have our anxieties. And how is God defined? I am who I am, who I am, who I am. God is here in the present moment. And I would mention to you briefly and quickly, but importantly, the work of Jean-Pierre de Caussade, The Abandonment of Divine Providence, magnificent work about living in the moment. More current work that I think is quite good is Edgar Tolle's stuff, The Power of Now. Getting into the moment. This is where God is. Okay? And everything that we need is right here, right now. So the invitation to beauty is to frame the moment. You see? To read poetry, you've got to slow down. You can't read poetry fast. To see beauty, you need to stop and look. To be with you as a human being and a beautiful person, I need to let other things go and just be here with you. Each person, right, unique in this universe. It's the invitation to beauty. The second is what I call the symphony of the word. And this, in a sense, can be most challenging for us because we think we know how to read the scriptures. And I want to say it in this way. And I'm glad we have one of our Franciscan brothers here, Chris. You'll be happy with this, Chris. There's a big difference. I'm somewhat of a comedian. It depends on which community is here what I speak about, right? But there's a major difference between Franciscan preaching and Dominican preaching. Right? Oh, let's not go there. I'm kind of skating on thin ice as it is, so let's. Franciscan preaching, St. Francis, he preached the laudes. Right? Dominican preaching was didactic. Right? It was the veritas, the truth. There's a place for it. Franciscan preaching, the laudes, was singing God's praises in the context of the universe. So when you study that particular genre in the Middle Ages, it's inviting people, this is what Francis and the friars did, inviting people into the song, inviting people into beauty, inviting people into an experience as they went around the world with the laudes, with the praises of God. A very different approach than starting from up here in the head. It was really inviting them in to the circle of beauty, singing the laudes in the context of the world. Now I want to suggest that that way of preaching becomes a way of approaching the scriptures themselves. And allow me just to say a few words about this. Jesus himself teaches us how to look at the scriptures as a work of beauty, an invitation to beauty. For every good Jew, the scrolls were so sacred that you had to wash your hands after touching them. Right? So therefore, you were encountering something that was sacred. Right? You had to wash your hands, and you treated the scriptures as really something deeply precious. Within Judaism, the technique for understanding the Bible may best be described as midrash, which means to seek. It is therefore understood as an investigation, seeking out the meaning of a biblical text. And there were two sorts of midrash in the time of Jesus. The midrash Haggadah, which had to do with legal rulings, what to do, and the midrash Haggalah, which elaborates on a story to bring out an important point. Now briefly, you see in the teaching of Jesus, he's using midrash. Right? So for example, when the lawyer asked a question, it was a question of halakha. Which is the first commandment? Right? And how did Jesus answer the question? He brought him to a deeper place. Right? He says, the love of God, love of neighbor, it's one and the same. So he's taking the question and bringing it to a deeper level. The same is true of Jesus' treatment of the Sabbath. He doesn't negate the Sabbath, one of the principal visions of the law, but he does revitalize it in two ways. He subordinates its observance to human perfection. The Sabbath is made for the human person. The human person was not made for the Sabbath. And so he says the Son of Man is master even of the Sabbath. So he's bringing the notion of Sabbath to a deeper place. Let me keep it simple and say it this way. How many of you here believe in Santa Claus? Okay, me, I'm the only one. Very good, no problem, I don't care. I stick to my belief. They say that there's 3 stages in life. First stage of life, you believe in Santa Claus. Second stage of life, you start acting like Santa Claus. Third stage of life, you start looking like Santa Claus. So, of course there's a Santa Claus. And I like to talk about the second naivete. See, the first naivete is when we see things just on the surface. So just on the surface, the first naivete, Santa Claus has the red suit and all of that. The second naivete, of course I believe in Santa Claus. I see Santa Claus every day, many times every day. Not necessarily with the red suit and all that, but nevertheless, on the level of the second naivete is the way of the heart. Santa Claus is happening all the time, right? And so the invitation of Jesus is bringing us to the second naivete, the place of beauty. Even after his resurrection, when you read the resurrection accounts, they don't recognize him on the level of the first naivete, right? They have to go to that second level, the second naivete, where they recognize Jesus. Weren't our hearts burning? The way of the heart. Franciscan preaching, the loudness. Weren't our hearts burning? The second naivete, right? That's the beauty of the Scriptures. It's not on the level of the first naivete. It's on the level of the second naivete. So beauty, then, the spirituality of beauty brings us to the Scriptures in new and profound ways. The third, my notes here, the third is us as artisans of the spiritual life. And I want to suggest that as you look at yourself as being an artist, there's an Indian Jesuit. His name is Herbert Alfonso. He wrote a great little book. It's about 40 pages called Discovering Your Personal Vocation. And I want to propose to you, every one of you has a personal vocation that's unique, right? And what he says, he gives the example. A Jesuit went and said, I haven't prayed for 10 years because nothing excites me. He says, well, what draws you? He says, well, the goodness of God does. Okay, well, pray with that. Jesuit comes back and says, I can pray again. He found that his way was getting in touch with the goodness of God. Someone like Mother Teresa of Calcutta, her way was being with the poor. God is multifaceted. No one of us, Ronner says, if all of us took everything we knew about God, it'd be a tiny dot on the wall. God's mystery. And each one of you reflects a different aspect of that mystery. Now, if we go to poetry, we see there's a great little piece by T.S. Eliot, if I can find it, here it is, called The Naming of Cats. I'm just going to quote it as illustrating what I'm trying to say. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one sort of your holiday games. You may think at first, I'm as mad as a hatter. But I tell you, a cat must have 3 different names. First of all, there's a name that the family used daily, such as Peter, Augustus, Alonzo, or James, such as Victor, or Jonathan, George, or Bill Bailey. All of them sensible, everyday names. There are fancier names, if you think they sound sweeter, some for the gentlemen, some for the dames, such as Plato, Admetus, Electra, and Demeter. But all of them sensible, everyday names. But I tell you, the cat needs a name that's particular, a name that's peculiar and more dignified. Else, how can he keep his tail perpendicular, or spread out his whiskers, or cherish his pride? Of names of this kind, I can give you a quorum, such as Munkenstrap, Quaxo, or Quirkerpack, such as Bombalurina or Jellalorum, names that never belong to more than one cat. But above and beyond there's still one name left over. And that is the name you will never guess. The name that no human research can discover. But the cat himself knows and will never confess. When you notice a cat in profound meditation, the reason I tell you is always the same. His mind is engaged in a rapt contemplation of the thought of his name. His ineffable, infallible, deep, and inscrutable singular name. So here's the point. Through poetry, finding out your name. Who are you? Who are you? Right? And I want to suggest that we still don't know. We're discovering each day. Who are you? And as you go into those deeper levels, God is there in new ways. You begin to discover how your heart is drawn to God. And everyone's heart is drawn in different ways. And the way your heart is drawn to God is very important, because that's how you bring beauty into it. Okay. Now, the final point I'm going to make, I'm going to skip a few of them because of the lack of time. But since we have these beautiful pictures I've got to talk about, and then we'll end there, and then I'll take some time to answer questions. This I'm sure you've seen. And by the way, I was going to speak about the shack, but that's okay. You read the book and whatever. It's, basically, what I wanted to get at is this. When we talk about God and God's beauty, you can't define God, right? If you see the Buddha, kill him, right? And by the way, let me put it to you this way. Religion, at its very worst, is very violent. At its very best, it brings love and peace into the world. Be careful of anyone who speaks for God rather than to God. Right? And so therefore, what I'm suggesting is this, and this is the most challenging of all, is going to new places in terms of who this God is. And we never fully capture this reality. And I would propose to you, so very good, is that we're rooted in a tradition, ever ancient, as Augustine says, but ever new. You can't exhaust who God is, right? And as we look to other religious traditions, right, as we talk to one another, we expand in terms of who this God is, right? If we keep our hearts open. In this beautiful piece by Rublev, and I'll conclude with this. They say, by the way, and again, this is I'm trying to bring art, literature, poetry, and so on into the book, both in the presentations, that this is the most perfect of all icons, right, in its symmetry. And as you know, probably, this icon, done by Rublev in the 11th century, is based on the book of Genesis, chapter 19, the visit of the three angels, Abraham and Sarah. And Rublev in the painting is saying, in fact, that the three angels prefigured the Trinity. Right? And so that's what he brings into the piece. Now, his use of color is so important. Right? There's something about blue, there's something about red. And what he's saying, in effect, is the blue, right, captures really the universe. Right? If you look around, blue is all over the place. Right? And the red, the blending of the blue and the red, is we get in touch with mystery, as Rublev is trying to get into in his use of color. And so when we start talking about art and beauty, color, we need to, we need to see in color. When you think of the Wizard of Oz, when they opened the castle door, they were no longer living in a black and white world. They walked into a world of color. Right? So color, we invite you into this world of color. The central figure, and of course, I'm just going to make a few comments. You can spend hours just talking about this piece. Right? The central figure is the figure of Christ. Right? And Rublev has there is the trick So Christ is the new Adam, the tree of the cross, etc. To the left is the figure of God our Father, right, and love. In my Father's house there are many mansions. So there you see the mansion, so to speak. And then to the right is the Spirit of God. And there's the mount of religious experience, right? And it is the Spirit of God who brings us to the experience of God. Now, what's most important is this. In this piece, if you notice, no one figure dominates over another. It's letting go of dominance. God is one who doesn't come to dominate. As our sisters can tell us, God is love. That is the best definition of God that we have. God is love. God is not dominance. So no one is dominating over the other. You also notice relationship. And again, because Chris is here, St. Bonaventure had it right. Aquinas had it wrong. Was there any Dominicans? Aquinas had it wrong. Aquinas, when he spoke of the world, spoke about it as proving the existence of God. Bonaventure says, kind of what Jordan Henry Hopkins would later capture, the whole universe is charged with the grandeur of God. And St. Bonaventure says, it's about, the Trinity is about relationships. It is the Father or Mother who gives themselves to the Son who comes to us and returns to the Father and sends us the Spirit. The Trinity is relationships. And what he says is that the world reflects relationship. It's all relatio. It's all relationship. That's the key, right? And what he says, and this is quite compelling, he says we exist only insofar as we are in relationship with God and in relationship with one another. If we're not in relationship with God and one another, St. Bonaventure says we don't even exist. You see? And so it's relatio, relationship. And that's what you see going on. That's the dynamism here. That's the beauty. That's the rhythm. It's relationship that's going on. You see? So when we speak about God, we speak always in those relational terms. And so I would pose to you that art and music, the scriptures, the world, and one another brings us to new places, for us to discover the God who is beautiful, right? And who invites us into his beauty. And I'll conclude with this, that a great image in the scriptures for God is the shepherd image, right? A great, great image. And I love the image for a lot of reasons that I won't get into now. But it's a great image of what God is like. Now, what I want to be very clear about, no one image captures them all. Right? So, multiple images. I just happen to be into this one these days. For whatever reason, shepherd image. And where does a shepherd lead us? Right? He leads us to the banquet of beauty. Right? It was, and I'll leave you with this, there's a story that's told about a professor who was giving a lecture on Psalm 23. And this guy was quite brilliant. Fortunately, he was one of those people who was so brilliant that he knew he was brilliant, and he had to let everyone else know how brilliant he was. And so he shows up to give the lecture, and there was a man sitting in the first row, and this man sitting in the first row was someone who never went beyond the third grade, but a deeply holy, beautiful man who knew who he was, who knew who his name was, who knew who his beauty was. And so the professor, to impress everyone, said, I'd like to begin my lecture by reciting to you Psalm 23. Show how smart he was, he began. The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. In verdant pastures he gives me repose, beside restful waters he leads me, refreshes my soul. He guides me along right paths for his name's sake, and even though I walk in the dark valley, I fear no evil, for your rod and your staff will give me courage. You spread the table before me in the sight of my foes, you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Only goodness and kindness follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So he finished. Some guy stood up and he said, Professor, that was quite impressive. But I'm going to tell you something. Professor, you know the son. Do you see this guy over here? He knows the shepherd. And that's the point. The spirituality of beauty brings us into the heart of the shepherd, who loves us with boundless charity, forgiveness,